and foreign trade in Sweden. Thank you very much to all of you for joining me. Welcome, welcome. Make yourselves comfortable and at home. To get us started, I'm going to start closest to me, if I may start with you. From a thought perspective, and even perhaps from an environmental perspective, what is it that makes PPPs work or be successful in your view?
Well, we have to put that in a more global context. Global context is that nothing can work if it's not going in the direction of a specific vision. You can have PPP for the worst, to produce bad things, and that would be a disaster. Then first, what do we do with it? What is the view? The view should be to build a country or a nation going in a good direction for the next 50 years, which means going in the direction of what I call the economy of life, which means getting rid of a bad dimension of what is ruining the environment, pollution, climate, everything, and move to the production of economy of life, which means renewable energy, good agriculture, water, recycling, education, culture, democracy, and so on. Then PPP is just like a hammer. A hammer can be used to kill or to build, but you have to put that in the context. Second, PPP has a very bad reputation for good reasons. It has been an occasion for hidden privatization, for a lot of corruptions, for taking the money out of the citizens, for private companies with no benefit for the communities, and I give you hundreds of examples around the world where PPP has been just an excuse to spoil a nation. But also we have good examples. In Africa, there are some good examples in solar energy, in roads, in highways, in many countries, from South Africa to Egypt, from Uganda to many, many different countries. The key conditions for that are the same key conditions for a good transition from economy of death to economy of life. Rule of law, fight against corruption, have a long-term vision. You cannot have PPP if you don't have a long-term vision. And it's very difficult. In many countries, not only in Africa, there is no rule of law. In many countries, not only in Africa, you have a lot of corruption. In many countries, not only in Africa, you have a short-term view of political leaders that are not in position to build because they don't know if they are going to be there next week. And the people that could be involved into a PPP or whatever kind of long-term investment need rule of law, transparency, fight against corruption, and long-term vision. It's difficult.
A little bit later on in the conversation, I want to come back for us to have a very brief conversation around conducive environments and policy frameworks that are conducive to PPP. So I'm going to ask you to hold your thoughts because I want to come back to that. Dr. Hala, if I can come back to you, your country has very specific examples of how PPPs can work if done right. What is it about yours that works?
Well, first, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to the FFI New Africa Summit. Well, basically, as you know, the African continent is concentrated with few countries on the private-public partnership projects. We're talking about Egypt, South Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Ghana. They basically represent about 50% of the PPP market in terms of value. As you mentioned, it helped bridge the gap in the infrastructure projects during the past decade, and basically these countries represent almost 50%, and the growth increased by about 30% year to year during the past decade. Egypt started its public partnership projects basically 2007. However, we enacted the law in 2010. We started with a simple project, which is the wastewater treatment project, and then we embarked on different projects, schools and other projects, But unfortunately, during the first phase, which I call it the preliminary or the trial phase, we only implemented about 4 to 5 projects due to a lot of challenges that we faced and a lot of lessons learned that we can share, and also due to the political instability that the country faced between 2011 and 2014. And then, starting the 2016, we had immense growth in the private-public partnership projects during this phase, ranging from wastewater treatment to energy distribution projects, dry ports, education, technical schools, strategic warehouses. So we had hundreds of projects, and of course with billions of US dollars. When we started the law, although we had a fairly advanced PPP law, but the issues at the beginning was that we had a sort of a fragmentation in the procurement process. We had the PPP law, however, we had also the simple tender law that people preferred. So this fragmentation gave a sort of an undesired appetite to go into which law? The procurement law gives you a vehicle for negotiation between the bidders and the authority. However, the other law was much simpler. The law was complex. That's why we amended the law in 2023. The other thing is that we had a centralized unit at the Ministry of Finance. We had to prepare for funding. All units need proper funding and need proper expertise. You have to equip the unit with proper expertise. So you need to ensure the funding for years to come, whether from donor funding or from the success fees that comes from successful bidding. The other thing is that you need to have a satellite PPP units inside different ministries. That's what we have implemented later in order for the ministries to be able to come out with the pipeline of projects that are bankable. A third important point is the funding. Commercial loans at the beginning used to offer short-term maturity loans. You need for the PPP long-term maturity loans. So the banks started moving into more long-term maturity loans, either separately with the commercial banks or jointly with an IFI loan. And the other important thing is that we started with some complex projects at the beginning, like the schools, while they used to be developed in 27 governorates. The distribution inside the governorates were quite complex. The acquisition of land and the provision of the sites was not easy. So that's why this was postponed, and we started implementing 345 schools started from the year 2017.
I think what's really interesting about the comments that you're making is that clearly when we're looking at PPPs, it has to be, okay, I was just about to ask you if you could drop your elbow because I couldn't see, is that there has to be a holistic approach, right?
Absolutely.
So it's not just about this is the project that we want to implement, but how do we make sure that it's long-term sustainable, and what are the supporting factors that are required? Minister Dusan, I know that you're going to have to leave us in not too long, so if I can just come to you. You have a particular example between what your country has done with Côte d'Ivoire that seems to be working and working really well. Can you share with us exactly what has made that project work and work as well as it has been?
Yes, of course, and thank you for inviting me here today as well. Working in PPPs is an essential tool for the Swedish growth model, with a dynamic private sector leading the way. This is a model that will now take us into new partnerships, not only in Africa but across the world, together with free trade agenda, with strong institutions, are the cornerstones of a well-functioning market system. The example you mentioned is in Abidjan right now, where we use both my portfolios as Minister for both Foreign Trade and International Development Corporation. One of the tools that we're using is the SWED Fund Project Accelerator. The tool helps finance pre-studies that quickly can identify how to solve problems and make projects kick off the ground. For instance, in Abidjan, as mentioned, we use this project accelerator to fund a pre-study for how to implement a bus rapid transit system in a city that was in very dire need to build a modern public transportation system. The study showed that it was not only possible to set up a BRT system, but also how to do it and how to finance it. With this, we helped to unlock financings from, for instance, the World Bank for infrastructure needed. However, we also made it possible to Swedish export firms and finance Swedish export solutions at very attractive terms, which added to the whole package from the Swedish side. This made it possible for international companies, including Swedish companies, to come in with more advanced, clean, and efficient transport solutions. These models that are now applied, we're actually looking into Cairo right now, and I think it's good news for all of us. So we're working together with our partners, and the PPP model is quite good.
One of the key issues that have already come up twice, Marlene, if I can come to you next, the question of funding. Whether we're talking about funding and the concerns that many people look at, Africa's a risk, our money's going to disappear, et cetera, whether it's about governments ensuring that there is adequate funding and longer-term funding for PPP projects, whether one is talking about where that funding is coming from, whether it's domestically funded, externally funded. Let's talk for a moment about funding for PPPs. What is it that we have to look at doing differently to ensure that not just these concerns are allayed around corruption, but that is actually different thinking about the allocation and availability of the capital that can allow, one, projects to get going, how we monitor those in the medium term, but ensure that there is enough flow of capital to allow it to get to fruition at the back end?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for attending. This is a very important question, and it's complicated and simple at the same time. I've been in finance for over 20 years, and I will always say there's plenty of capital in the world, and capital loves to be well taken care of. So capital that comes back, that is well deployed, that provides return, that provides impact, is capital that you will always find. So back to what was said by Dr. Attali and my esteemed co-panelist, I think the first thing is you have to make sure that you have a project that is bankable. How do you have a project that is bankable? The first thing is you have to be straightforward and ensure that each party knows the expectations of the other. So the private sector partners are going to have an obligation to seek impact, but also profitability, sustainability. That needs to be said straight away. The government, on the other end, will have a certain other more long-term social impact that has to be defined very clearly. And I think it's not just those two parties. You actually have to involve all of the stakeholders in the value chain. So we spoke about the communities, but there are also the suppliers, the EPC, many different parties. The more everybody is at the table at the beginning and we understand the expectation of each other, the better it is. Then after that, you have to understand the obligations and the responsibility of each of the parties. That's very important. That has to be captured in the right regulatory or legal framework. Oftentimes, we're able to borrow from other jurisdictions. So you'll find certain parts of the partnerships that are under jurisdictions that give us a lot of jurisprudence where we know how to resolve any dispute if there are any. Then you have to implement, but I think you have to keep an open mind. It's like any long-term relationship. You have to, after you have implemented, be able to take a look and say, have I fulfilled my obligation? Have you? Is there a problem? And if there's a problem, the agreement should not be frozen. You should have an opportunity to come back to the table, adjust it, embed that into the mechanism, and then I'll finish with the last point, which is transparency. Yeah. At the end of the day, you want transparency along the value chain to ensure that those are win-win for all of the stakeholders that you involve at the beginning. That's very important. And if you have that, you will find the capital at FEDA. No, hold on. At FEDA, I'll say it. At FEDA, as you know, we used to finance these with debt, longer-term debt, but now we do it with equity. Yeah. We just signed a few weeks ago, you'll find it on the internet, a $440 million deal with Arise IIP, which is the largest industrial park business in Africa, operating in 12 countries. That's $500 million almost of equity that we injected to make sure that that long-term project that we view as important for the transformation in Africa over the next 20 years is adequately capitalized.
I think what's interesting about what you speak of is this need for, yes, capital needs to be taken care of on the one hand, but the relationships that foster a successful PPP also have to be taken care of, including transparency. Dr. Attali, if I can then come to you, if we are looking at the financing mechanisms, some of which Marlene has just alluded to, in addition to the basic requirements of what makes it work, do we need to be doing something differently to what we're doing now so that the outcome is more success rather than not?
No, thank you very much for having me here today. As you know, and most of the public knows, BADEA, the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, has been established 50 years back by 18 Arab countries, and Saudi Arabia is a major shareholder, and the mandate of the bank is exclusively for Africa. So this bank has been there to support Africa since inception. And at the beginning, the bank was focusing only on public sector projects. And later on, the bank moved to PPPs. And we are really proud to mention that over 50 years, the bank has zero loss in Africa. This is very important to understand the risk perception of African projects. And we have a level of NPL which is below 0.5%. So this shows that the perception of risk in Africa is just a matter of communication, not a reality. So going back to your question about PPPs, so what is needed to have a successful PPP is to have first a bankable project. And to have a very clear legal, institutional, and regulatory framework, which is based on a conducive business environment. So the different parties involved in the operation should be transparent to each other, and the risk allocation should be based on equity. So each type of risk, so risk assessment and risk mitigation should be based on the party who is the best placed to bear the risk. So if we put the risk on a party which is not the right party, that will create a problem later on. So to be successful, a PPP project should give a particular attention to the risk allocation, because risk allocation is key in the relationship. This is why most of the PPP are renegotiated after, because during the negotiation, some parties try to let the risk be borne by a different party, which is not the right party to.
So if it's a question then of thinking differently about risk and people reevaluating what their appetite for risk is going to be on the African continent, so if that's one thing we need to think differently about, do we need to also think differently about how we measure the success question? So when we say success in an African PPP, what are we actually meaning? Do we need to be thinking differently about that?
So the success should be measured in two ways. First, impact. What is the impact of the project on the population, on the beneficiary? But also the reward for the participant, for the various stakeholders, including the investor. Because if the investor is not rewarded, he will not invest again. Yeah. And if we look at PPP projects in Africa, we realize that the bulk, more than 50% are in energy generation. Yes. So you will realize that most of them are, and second came ports, and then telecom. So you will not find many projects in health, in education, in agriculture. Yeah. And also, as mentioned by Dr. Hala, it's concentrated in some countries. So most of the African countries are not really benefiting from financing under PPP projects. And last but not least, even the whole continent over the past 10 years received only 126 billion of FDIs in terms of PPPs, which is nothing compared to the bonanza worldwide.
Yeah. Dr. Attali, you wanted to add some comments, and then Dr. Hala, I'll come to you.
Well, two things. One, what was said before about the fact that it's important to associate the different communities involved, not only the financiers and the state, is very important. And that is linked to the fact that we need to have a larger view of the impact. The impact is not only the fact that the project is done and that is efficient, etc., but what is the impact in terms of environment, in terms of energy saving, in terms of CO2 emission, in terms of education, health, etc. But we need to have a global view of impact. And also, as a prerequisite, a very simple prerequisite, is a PPP a better solution than something done by the state? Yeah. Does the state, the government, the ministers can do better or not? And the PPP has to be chosen only, in my view, if it's demonstrated that it's better than done by the government. And very often it's true. As we have seen in Egypt, very often it's true. But it has to be demonstrated first before and then after as a lesson. We have so many examples of PPP which was only, including in European countries, only a way for governments to give a favor to some private companies with many other dimensions and behind, that's not going to be efficient for the use of taxpayers' money.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have two comments, one related to the impact and the other to the de-risking issue. For the impact, basically most of the countries are promoting the definition of the public-private partnership as it's a benefit to the public, to the authorities, to the government. It has to be always elaborated as a win-win situation. There is a lot of risk entailed on the private sector. He's entering in most of the off-take agreements for a longer term agreement. So it has to be always defined on the benefits for both sides, not only for the government. The other thing is that for the environmental projects, and now a lot of countries, and Egypt is one of them, are embarking in a lot of renewable energy projects. We have all the potential for that. We have the sun, we have the wind, so we have projects, solar projects, we have wind projects, we have hydrogen projects now. So all these projects, most of the public and private sector are defining it or measuring the impact in terms of value for money. We have to have the metrics of the decrease that is happening in the emission. What is the benefit to the environment? This is an important point. So the other point is the de-risking. We came in Egypt in the past 5 years on establishing sovereign wealth funds. Sovereign wealth funds are a brilliant mechanism for the PPP because it's an investment arm of the government whereby its main role is to crowd in the private sector. So you study the project, you pitch in finance as an equity, so you're sharing the risk with the private sector. So I think this is a very important mechanism also to encourage the PPP in most of the developing and emerging economies.
We're running out of time so quickly. Marlene, if I can come to you really, really quickly, and I'd love to hear your words, each of you, on this. We don't have time to go into too much detail, but the question of AI and how it can improve or better work with structuring PPPs or rolling them out, really, really briefly, do you think it's a yay or a nay?
I think it's a yes. I think that AI is an amazing opportunity for Africa to actually leapfrog on a lot of the elements where we're lagging. I think that we would need to continue to find efficiency, continue to find transparency. I think AI can help in that. I just want us to be conscious to do it without sacrificing creating jobs for human beings and making sure that our youth is adequately trained to take advantage of this formidable opportunity to leapfrog on a lot of spaces.
Dr. Tia?
Yeah, AI is definitely a good opportunity for leapfrogging, but we need to be prepared and to have the right infrastructure. And it is why we at the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, we have funded a study to have an African cloud. We are working with Smart Africa, which is based an organization in Kigali, and the objective is to be prepared to reap the benefit of AI at the continent level, because without the right infrastructure, we will not be able to do much.
Yeah. Dr. Hala, and then I'll give the last word to yourself.
I think it's very important for countries that are starting the public-private partnership to start with small, not complex projects, and projects that have a societal impact So people have the buy-in of people, raise the profile of the governorates in order to encourage the governorates to be part of that, and have a standardized assessment of feasibility study. Have an international guidelines for assessing feasibility study for the public-private partnership is very important.
Dr. Attali, last word to you.
Yeah, I think it's, but I know what has been said on AI and other dimensions. It's important that the public servants have the same level of competence than the partners in the private sector. Because if not, the PPP will not be balanced. And if more you use AI, the more you will have competences in the private sector. And the risk is that the public sector, people in charge of making the PPP, will be weakened by that. It's why the use of international benchmark, international procedures is very important, but to train the public servant is fundamental.
I think it's so interesting that throughout this conversation, what stands out for me is the ecosystem, right? That we need the people who have the right competency on both sides, not just on the public side, but on both sides, but also the regulatory framework that is conducive, you know, the financial framework that is conducive, but also thinking differently about how we approach PPP on the African continent. De-risking being key, we think differently around risk, but also how we can better make sure that they are fit for purpose on the continent, that they are sustainable, and that they're eventually beneficial. Would you all agree?
Agree.
Did I do okay with the summary? All right, to all of you, thank you so very much for joining me. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you to thank my panelists. Thank you. Dr. Attali, if I can ask you.